The next morning in his toilet, the emperor asked me if anyone had noticed the change he had made in the program. At the risk of lying, I told him no. At that moment entered one of the emperor's intimates, who was unmarried. Pinching his ears, his majesty said to him, "Marry a German, my dear fellow. They are the best women in the world, gentle, good, artless, and as fresh as roses." His majesty's air of satisfaction made it very easy to see that he was making a portrait, and then it was not long since the painter had quitted the model. After certain cares given to his person, the emperor returned to the empress, and toward noon he had breakfast sent up for both of them, having it served near the bed and by the empress's women. He was charmingly gay all the remainder of the day, having, contrary to his custom, made a second toilet for dinner. He put on the coat that had been made for him by the tailor of the King of Naples, but he would have none of it the next day, saying that it was decidedly too tight a fit. As may be seen from the foregoing details, the emperor loved his new spouse tenderly. He paid her continual attentions, and his whole conduct towards her was that of a very deeply smitten lover. At the same time, it is not true, as has been reported, that for 3 months he scarcely worked at all. To the great astonishment of his ministers, work was not simply a duty with the emperor. It was a necessity and a pleasure from which no other pleasure could divert him. In his circumstance, as in any other, he was perfectly well able to harmonize the exigencies of his empire and his armies with his love for his charming wife. The Empress Marie Louise was barely 19 years old at the epoch of her marriage. Her hair was light, her eyes blue and expressive, her bearing noble, and her figure imposing. Her hand and foot might have served as models. Her whole person, in fine, breathed youth, health, and freshness. She was timid and maintained a haughty reserve in presence of the court, but was said to be affectionate and friendly in private. It is certain that she was very loving with the emperor and devoted to all his wishes. In their first interview, the emperor had asked her what parting instructions had been given to her in Vienna. "To be yours," the empress had responded, "and to obey you in all things." And she seemed to find no difficulty in complying with these instructions. For the rest, nothing could be less like the first empress than the second. One point alone excepted: the evenness of their temper and their extreme complacence for the emperor. The one was the exact opposite of the other, and it must be owned the emperor often congratulated himself on this difference, in which he found piquancy and charm. He drew the following parallel between his 2 wives. The one, Josephine, was all art and graces; the other, Marie Louise, innocence and simple nature. There was no moment in life in which the manners or habitudes of the first were not agreeable or attractive. It would have been impossible to find fault with her on that point. She studied how to produce none but advantageous impressions, and attain her object without allowing the study to become evident. All that art could devise to enhance attractions was put into service by her, but with such mystery that at best one could but suspect it. The second, on the contrary, did not even surmise that there was anything to be gained by innocent artifices. The one was always eluding the truth. Her first impulse was a denial. The other knew nothing of dissimulation. All evasion was foreign to her. The first never asked for anything, but she owed in every direction. The second never hesitated to ask when she had nothing left, which was very seldom. She never took anything without feeling bound in conscience to pay for it at once. As for the rest, both of them were good, gentle, and greatly attached to their husband. Such, or very nearly such, were the terms in which the emperor spoke of the 2 empresses. It is evident that he wished the comparison to be advantageous to the second, and to this end he attributed to her qualities she did not possess, or at least curiously exaggerated those which she might have had. The emperor allowed Marie Louise 500,000 francs for her toilette, but she seldom or never spent that sum. She had very little taste, and would have dressed herself ungracefully if she had not been well advised. The emperor was present at her toilette on days when he desired it to be good. He made her try different ornaments, putting them himself on her head, neck, and arms, and always deciding for the magnificent. The emperor was an excellent husband, and he proved it with both of his wives. He adored his son. As father and husband, he might have served as a model to all of his subjects. At the same time, whatever he may have said about it himself, I do not believe that he loved Marie Louise as well as Josephine. The latter had a charm, a kindness, a spirit, a devotion which her husband, the emperor, knew, and which he esteemed at its full worth. Marie Louise was younger, but cold and somewhat ungracious. I think she loved her husband, but she was reserved, not at all expansive, and she could not make Josephine forgotten by those who had the happiness of approaching her. Notwithstanding the apparent submission with which she had dismissed her Austrian household, it is certain that she entertained strong prejudices, not merely against their new one, but also against that of the emperor. She never addressed a kindly word to those in personal attendance on the emperor. I have seen her many times, but never was there a smile, a glance, a sign from her to signify that I was other than a stranger in her eyes. On returning from Russia, whence I did not arrive until after the emperor, I lost no time in repairing to his room, where he expected me. I found his majesty in the company of the empress and Queen Hortense. The emperor greatly compassionated the sufferings I had undergone and said many flattering things which displayed his kindness towards me. The queen, with that charming grace of which she is the only model since the death of her august mother, talked with me a long time and in terms full of benevolence. The empress alone kept silence. The empress said to her, "Louise, have you nothing to say to this poor Constant?" "I had not perceived him," replied the empress. This answer was severe, for it was impossible that her majesty should not have perceived me. At that moment, there was no one in the room excepting the emperor, Queen Hortense, and me. The emperor took at once the greatest precautions that no person, above all no man, should be able to approach the empress except in the presence of witnesses. In the time of the Empress Josephine, there had been 4 ladies whose sole employment was to announce the persons who were received by Her Majesty. The excessive kindliness of Josephine prevented her from repressing the jealous pretensions of some members of her household, and thence ensued rivalries and squabbles without end between the ladies of the palace and the announcing ladies. The emperor had been very much annoyed by these quarrels, and to avoid them for the future, he selected 4 new dames d'honneur for the Empress Marie Louise from among the ladies charged with the education of the daughters of members of the Legion of Honor, the establishment of écuyers. The preference was at first given to the daughters or widows of generals, and the emperor decided that the best pupils from that imperial establishment should thenceforward be entitled to all vacancies and might merit them by good conduct. The number of these ladies having afterwards been increased to 6, 2 pupils of Madame Campan were chosen. These 6 ladies afterwards changed their original appellation to that of First Ladies of the Empress, but this change having dissatisfied the ladies of the palace and caused them to complain to the emperor. The latter decided that the announcing ladies should take the title of First Chamberwomen. Great complaints from the dames d'honneur in their turn. They pleaded their cause in person before the emperor, and he gave them the title of readers to the empress in order to conciliate the requirements of the 2 belligerent parties. The announcing ladies, or the first ladies, or the first chambermen, or the readers, as the reader may choose to call them, had 6 chambermaids under their orders who had never entered the room of the empress unless summoned by the bell. These dressed the empress, put on her shoes, and combed her hair, but the first 6 had nothing to do with the toilette except for the diamonds, which were in their special custody. Their principal and almost only employment was to be always at the heels of the empress, whom they followed like her shadow. They came into her room before she got up and never left her until after she'd gone to bed. Then every door leading to her chamber was locked, with the exception of one that opened into a neighboring room containing the bed of whichever of these ladies was on duty. Even the emperor could not enter his wife's room at night without passing through this chamber, with the exception of Monsieur de Meneval, private secretary of Her Majesty, and Monsieur Balouhet, steward of her expenditures. No man was admitted to the private apartments of the empress without an order from the emperor. Even ladies, excepting the lady of honor and the lady of the bedchamber, were not received there, but by special appointment with the empress. The ladies of the interior were charged with the execution of these regulations and were responsible for them. One of them was always present at the lessons taken by the empress in music, drawing, and embroidery. They wrote letters from her dictation or by her order. The emperor said he was unwilling that any man in the world should be able to boast of having been alone with the empress for 2 minutes, and he one day very severely reprimanded the reader on duty because she had remained at the further end of the salon while Monsieur Biennet, the court jeweler, was showing Her Majesty the secrets of a set of pigeonholes which he had made for her. And at another time, the Empress scolded because the lady on duty had not kept close beside the Empress while the latter was talking to her, taking her music lesson from Monsieur Payer. Hence, it is not true, as has been claimed, that Leroy, the man milliner, had been excluded from the palace for having presumed to tell the Empress that she had beautiful shoulders. While he was trying on her dress, Monsieur Leroy had the robes of the Empress made in his establishment after a pattern that had been sent him. Neither he nor anyone from there ever tried them on Her Majesty. The changes he had to make were pointed out to him by the chambermaids. It was the same with other tradespeople and purveyors, corset makers, shoemakers, glove makers, etc. Not one of them could see the Empress or speak with her in her private apartments. Chapter 15. The civil marriage of their Majesties was celebrated at the Palace of St. Cloud on Sunday, April 1st at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The religious marriage took place in the Grand Gallery of the Louvre the following day. A rather singular circumstance was that the weather was fine at St. Cloud on Sunday evening, while the streets of Paris were inundated by heavy and continuous rain. On Monday, it rained at St. Cloud, and the weather was magnificent at Paris, as if to detract nothing from the pomp of the procession and the brilliancy of the marvelous illuminations in the evening. The Emperor's star, said the people, in the language of the period, has twice carried the day against the equinoctial winds. One Monday evening, the city of Paris presented such a spectacle that one might have thought himself in an enchanted place. I have never seen such brilliant illuminations. It was a succession of magical decorations. Houses, hotels, palaces, churches, all were dazzling. Even to the church towers, which seemed like stars or comets, hung in air. The residences of the great dignitaries of the empire, the ministers, the ambassadors of Austria and Russia, and that of the Duke de Brontes, vied with each other in splendor and good taste. Place Louis XV presented an admirable spectacle. From the middle of this place, surrounded by orange trees of flame, the eyes rolled alternately to the magnificent decoration of the Champs-Élysées, the Garde Meuble, the Temple of Glory, the Tuileries, and the Court Legislative. The latter palace represented the temple of Hymen. The transparency of the pediment represented peace, uniting the august spouses. On either side of them were genii carrying bucklers, on which were displayed the armorial bearings of the two empires. Behind this group came magistrates, warriors, and the people, presenting them with crowns. At the two extremities of the transparency were the Seine and the Danube, surrounded with children, an image of fecundity. The 12 columns of the Paris style and the flight of steps leading to it were illuminated. The columns were united by chandeliers. The statues adorning the Paris style and perron were lighted up. The Louis XV bridge, which conducted to this temple of Hymen, was itself an avenue whose double range of fires, colored lamps, obelisks, and its more than 100 columns, each surmounted by a star and joined together by spiral garlands of colored lamps, were almost too insupportably brilliant to be looked at. The cupola of the dome of St. Genevieve was also magnificently illuminated. Each side of it was defined by a double row of lanterns. Between these were eagles, monograms in colored lamps, and fiery garlands depending from the torch of Hymen. The Paris style of the dome was lighted by chandeliers placed between the columns, and as the latter were not illuminated, the chandeliers seemed to be hanging in air. The lantern was all in fire, and the whole brilliant mass was surmounted by a tripod representing the altar of Hymen, whence escaped an immense flame, produced of bituminous materials at a great height above the platform of the observatory. An immense star, isolated from the platform and caused to scintillate like a vast diamond by the variety of colored lamps which formed it, stood out against a black sky. The Senate House also attracted large crowds of sightseers, but I have already lingered too long over this description of the marvelous sights that greeted the eye at every step. The city of Paris presented Her Majesty the Empress with a toilette service, still more magnificent than it had offered to the Empress Josephine. Everything was in silver gilt, even to the armchair, and the full-length dressing glass. The designs for the different pieces of this truly admirable set of furniture had been made by the first artists, and the elegance and finish of the ornamentation surpassed even the richness of the metal. Toward the end of April, their majesties visited the departments of the north together. This journey was a repetition of that which I had made in 1804 in the train of the emperor, only the empress was not now the good and gracious Josephine. In passing through all these cities where I had seen her welcomed with so much enthusiasm and whose good wishes and homage were now addressed to another sovereign, in revisiting the Chateau of Laeken, Brussels, Antwerp, Boulogne, and many other places where I had seen Josephine passing in triumph, as Marie Louise was doing now, I thought with sadness and regret of the isolation of the emperor's first wife and the anguish which could not fail to pursue her even in her retirement when the story should arrive of the honors paid to her by whom she had been succeeded in the heart of the emperor and on the imperial throne. The king and queen of Westphalia and Prince Eugene accompanied their majesties. At Antwerp, we saw them launch a 24-gun ship, which was blessed by Monsieur de Pratt, Archbishop of Malines. Before it left the stocks, the King of Holland came to join the emperor at Antwerp. There was a coolness between this prince and his majesty, who had quite recently demanded from him the cession of a part of his dominions, and who soon after laid hands on all the rest. Nevertheless, he came to Paris during the marriage festivities of the emperor, who had even set him to meet the Empress Marie Louise, but the two brothers had not relinquished their natural distrust, and it must be admitted that of the King Louis was too well founded. What seemed to me most singular in their altercations was that the emperor, in his brother's absence, would fly into the greatest passions and utter the most violent threats against him, while if they were to have an interview, they greeted each other in an amicable and familiar way, like two brothers. Apart, one was the emperor of the French and the other king of Holland. Together they were, if I may be allowed to so express myself, nothing but Napoleon and Louis, companions and friends from infancy. However, Prince Louis was habitually sad and melancholy. The contrarieties he experienced on the throne, where he had been placed in spite of himself, added to his domestic griefs, rendered him evidently unhappy. And all those who knew him commiserated him most sincerely, for King Louis was an excellent master, a meritorious and an honest man. It has been said that when the emperor had decreed the reunion of Holland and France, King Louis resolved to defend himself to the last extremity in the city of Amsterdam and to break the dikes and inundate the whole country in order to prevent the invasion of French troops. I do not know whether that is true, but from what I have seen of the character of this prince, I am very sure that, although he had sufficient personal courage to expose himself to all the chances of so desperate a step, his natural kindliness and humanity would have prevented him from carrying such a plan into execution. At Middelburg, the emperor went aboard the Charlemagne to visit the mouths of the Scheldt, the port of the island of Flushing. During this excursion, we were assailed by a terrible squall. 3 anchors were broken in succession. We sustained other damages and incurred great danger. The emperor was very seasick. He was constantly throwing himself on his bed and making repeated efforts to vomit without being able to succeed, which rendered his condition still more distressing. Fortunately, I was not at all inconvenienced and was therefore able to render him all the assistance which his case required. All the members of his suite were likewise ill. My uncle, who was the usher on duty and consequently obliged to remain standing at the door of His Majesty's cabin, fell down every minute and suffered horribly. During this torment, which lasted 3 days, the emperor was boiling with impatience. "I think," said he, when we could at last approach him, that I would have made a rather indifferent admiral. Shortly after our return from this journey, the Emperor wished Her Majesty the Empress to learn how to ride. She went to the riding school of St. Cloud. Several members of the household were in the tribune to see her take her first lesson. I was among them, and I saw the tender solicitude evinced by the Emperor for his young wife. She was mounted on a gentle and very well-broken horse. The Emperor never let go her hand, and Mr. Jourdain held the horse's bridle. At the first step it made, the Empress screamed with alarm, and the Emperor said to her, "Come on, Louise, be brave. What canst thou fear? Am I not here?" The lesson passed in encouragements on one side and frights on the other. The next day the Emperor ordered those who were in the tribunes to be sent away because their presence intimidated the Empress. She soon got used to it and ended by riding very well. She often rode in the park with her ladies of honor and Madame the Duchess of Montebello, who also rode with grace. The Empress was followed by several ladies in an open carriage. Prince Aldobrandini, her equerry, never left her in these excursions. The Empress was at the age when one has a fondness for balls and festivities, and the Emperor dreaded above all things that she should be bored. Hence diversions and entertainments abounded at court and in the city. A fête offered to their majesties by Prince Schwarzenberg, the Austrian ambassador, had a frightful termination. The prince occupied the former hotel de Montesson in the Rue Chaussée d'Antin. For the purposes of his ball, he had added to the already existing apartments a vast hall and a wooden gallery, decorated with a profusion of flowers, draperies, and chandeliers, etc. At the moment when the Emperor was about to retire, after spending 2 or 3 hours at the fête, a draught of air caught one of the curtains and blew it into the flame of some candles placed too near the windows, and it ignited instantly. Several young men made vain efforts to extinguish the fire by tearing down the draperies and stifling the flame with their hands. In the twinkling of an eye, the paper wreaths and garlands were consumed, and the woodwork had begun to burn. The Emperor was among the first to perceive the fire and foresee its consequences. He approached the Empress, who had already risen to go to him, and went out with her, but not without difficulty, on account of the crowds precipitating themselves towards the doors. The Queens of Holland, Naples, Westphalia, the Princess Borghese, etc., followed their majesties. The Vice Queen of Italy, who was far advanced in pregnancy, had remained in the hall on the platform where the imperial family were seated. The Viceroy, dreading the crush for his wife almost as much as the fire, took her out through a small door contrived on the platform for the purpose of bringing refreshments to their majesties. No one had thought of this exit before Prince Eugène, but several persons availed themselves of it to depart when he did. Her Majesty, the Queen of Westphalia, did not think herself in safety when she had reached the terrace, and in her fright ran into the Rue Taitbout, where she was picked up by a passerby. The Emperor accompanied the Empress as far as the entrance of the Champs-Élysées. There he left her in order to return to the fire, and did not re-enter St. Cloud until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. We had been in a fearful state of alarm since the arrival of the Empress. Not a soul in the chateau but was a prey to keen anxiety concerning the Emperor. At last he arrived without accident, but very much fatigued, his clothes in disorder, and his face heated by the conflagration. His shoes and stockings were scorched and blackened by the fire. He went straight to the apartment of the Empress to assure himself if he had entirely recovered from the fright she had experienced. Then he came to his own room, and throwing his hat onto his bed and dropping into an armchair, he exclaimed, "My God, what a fête!" I noticed that the Emperor's hands were all blackened. He had lost his gloves at the fire. His Majesty was profoundly depressed. While I was undressing him, he asked whether I had been at the Prince's fête. I told him no, whereupon he deigned to give me some details of the deplorable event. The Emperor spoke with an emotion I never beheld in him before. More than 2 or 3 times in his life, and which he did not experience for his own misfortunes. This night's conflagration, said His Majesty, has consumed a heroic woman, the sister-in-law of Prince Schwarzenberg. Hearing cries from the burning hall, which she thought to be those of her eldest daughter, plunged into the midst of the flames. The floor, already reduced to charcoal, broke under her feet. She disappeared. The poor mother had been in error. All her children were out of danger. Unheard of efforts were made to extricate her from the flames, but she was dead when these succeeded, and all the attempts of the physician to recall her to life were lavished in vain. The unhappy princess was with child and far advanced in pregnancy. I advised the prince myself to endeavor to save the life of the infant at least. It was taken living from its mother's corpse, but it lived only a few moments. The emotion of the emperor redoubled at the close of this recital. I had taken care to have a bath all ready for him, knowing that he would need it on his return. His Majesty did in fact take one, and after the customary frictions, he found himself, as they say, quite set up again. I recollect, however, that he expressed a fear lest the terrible accident of this night might be a harbinger of disastrous events. And he long retained this apprehension. 3 years afterwards, during the deplorable Russian campaign, it was one day announced to the emperor that the army corps commanded by Prince Schwarzenberg had been destroyed and that the prince himself had perished. It turned out happily that the tidings were false, but when they were brought to His Majesty, he exclaimed, as if in answer to an idea that had long preoccupied him, then it was he that was menaced by that evil omen. Toward morning, the emperor sent pages to the houses of all those who had suffered from the catastrophe to present them with his compliments and make inquiries for their health. Sad replies were returned to His Majesty. Madame the Princess of Latlayen, niece of the Prince Primate, had succumbed to her wounds. The lives of General Tuzar, his wife, and his daughter were despaired of, and they did, in fact, die that day. There were still other victims of this disaster. Among those who escaped after long sufferings were Prince Kurakin and Madame Duranel, wife of the general of that name. Prince Kurakin, always noticeable for the brilliancy as well as the singular taste of his attire, had dressed himself for the ball in a coat of cloth of gold. It was this that saved him. Sparks and firebrands slipped over his coat and the decorations by which it was covered, as if it had been a cuirass. The prince kept his bed for several months, however, in the tumult caused by the fire. He had fallen on his back and was for a long time trodden underfoot and bruised by the crowd. He owed his life solely to the presence of mind and strength of the musician who had picked him up and carried him out of the throng. General Duranel, whose wife had fainted in the ballroom, sprang into the midst of the flames and reappeared almost at once with his precious burden in his arms. He carried Madame Duranel in this way to a house in the boulevard, where he laid her down in order to go and look for a carriage in which she might be taken back to his residence. Madame the Countess Duranel had been cruelly burned and was ill for more than 2 years in consequence. While the general was crossing over from the house of the ambassador to the boulevard, he saw by the light of the fire a robber stealing the comb from his wife's head as she lay fainting in his arms. This comb was enriched with diamonds and very costly. Madame Duranel had an affection for her husband which equaled that he entertained for her. At the close of a sanguinary combat of the Second Polish Campaign, General Duranel was missing for several days, and someone wrote to France that he was believed to be dead. The disconsolate countess fell ill with grief and was at the point of death, but not long after, word was received that the general had been found grievously wounded, but not fatally so, and that his recovery would be prompt. When Madame Duranel received these happy tidings, her joy almost reached delirium. She made a heap of all of her mourning apparel and that of her servants in the court of her residence, set fire to it, and watched the burning of these lugubrious vestments with transports and ebullitions of extravagant gaiety. 2 days after the destruction of Prince Schwarzenberg's hotel, the emperor received news of the abdication of his brother Louis. At first, His Majesty seemed much annoyed by this event and said to someone who entered his chamber just after he had been informed of it, "I had foreseen this foolishness on the part of Louis, but I did not think he would be in such a hurry about it." Nevertheless, the emperor soon came to a decision on the subject, and a few days later, His Majesty, who had not opened his lips during his toilet, suddenly emerged from his reverie, just as I handed him his coat, and giving me 2 or 3 of his familiar taps. "Monsieur Constant," he said to me, Do you know what are the 3 capitals of the French Empire? And without giving me time to answer, he went on. Paris, Rome, Amsterdam. That makes a good effect. Don't you think so? Chapter 16. In the last days of July, people went in throngs to the Church of the Invalides, where the bodies of General St. Hilaire and the Duc de Montebello were deposited. The marshal's remains were placed near the tomb of Turenne. The mornings were spent in the celebration of several masses, which were said on a double altar erected between the nave and the dome. During 4 days, a long streamer or black pennant bordered with white floated from the steeple of the dome. On the very day when the remains of the marshal were translated from the Church of the Invalides to the Pantheon, I was sent from St. Cloud to Paris on a private message from the emperor. I had still a few moments of leisure after my commission was executed, and I employed them in going to see this doleful ceremony and saying a last adieu to the brave warrior whose death I had witnessed. At noon, all the civil and military authorities repaired to the hotel. The body was transferred from the dome into the church under a catafalque in the shape of a great Egyptian pyramid borne on a raised platform opened by 4 large arches, the supports of which were garlanded with laurels interlaced with cypress. At the corners were statues in the attitude of grief, representing force, justice, prudence, and temperance, the characteristic virtue of heroes. This pyramid was terminated by a cinerary urn surrounded by a fiery crown. On the sides of the pyramid were the armorial bearings of the Duke and medallions recalling the most memorable deeds of his life upheld by weeping genii. Under the obelisk was placed the sarcophagus containing his body. At the angles were trophies composed of flags taken from different enemies. Silver candlesticks in great profusion were fixed on the steps, which served as a platform for this monument. The oak altar, replaced where it had been before the Revolution, was double and had a double tabernacle. On the tabernacle doors were the tables of the law. It was surmounted by a great cross, on the transverse arms of which a winding sheet was suspended. At the corners, the altar were the statues of St. Louis and St. Napoleon. 4 large candelabra were placed on pedestals at the angles of the steps. The pavement of the choir and that of the nave were covered with a mourning carpet. The pulpit, draped in black and decorated with the imperial eagle from which the marshal's funeral oration was delivered, was placed on the left and in front of the catafalque. On the right was an ebony seat decorated with the imperial arms, beads, stars, galloons, fringes, and other ornaments in silver plate. It was intended for the Prince Archchancellor of the Empire, who presided at the ceremony. Some steps had been raised in the arches of the side aisles corresponding to the tribunes, which were above. In front of these steps were seats and benches for the civil and military authorities, the cardinals, archbishops, bishops, etc. The arms decorations, baton, and laurel crown of the marshal lay on his coffin. The whole nave and the back of the side aisles were hung with black with white borders. So were the windows. On these draperies were displayed the baton and monogram of the marshal. The organ was hidden by vast hangings which did not impede the production of its mournful sounds. 18 sepulchral lamps of silver were suspended by chains of the same metal from lances terminating in banners taken from the enemy. On the pilasters of the nave were fixed trophies of arms composed of flags taken in the different battles in which the marshal had taken part. The altar railing on the side next to the esplanade was hung with mourning. Above it were the arms of the Duke, kept in place by 2 fames holding palms of victory. Above might be read the inscription, Napoleon, to the memory of the Duc de Montebello, who died gloriously on the field of Essling, May 22nd, 1809. The Conservatory of Music executed a mass made up of a selection from the finest of Mozart's sacred compositions. After the ceremony, the body was borne to the door of the church and placed upon the funeral car, which was adorned with laurels and 4 sheaves of flags taken from the enemy in the battles in which the marshal had been engaged and by the troops of his army corps. It was preceded by a military and religious procession and followed by one of glory and honor. The military cortege was made up of detachments of all arms, cavalry, light infantry, and the line, horse and foot artillery, followed by cannons, artillery wagons, sappers, and miners. The whole preceded by drums, trumpets, bands, etc. The general staff, with the Marshal Prince of Wagram at its head, comprising all the general officers and the staff of the division and the place. The religious procession included children and old men from the asylums, the clergy of all the parishes, and of the Metropolitan Church of Paris, with the crosses and banners, chanters, and religious music, and the chaplain of His Majesty with the assistants. The car which bore the marshal's body followed immediately behind it. The Marshal Duke de Conigliano, Count Serrier, the Duc d'Istrie, and Prince d'Aquemule held the quarters of the pall. On either side of the car, 2 aides-de-camp of the marshal carried 2 standards. On the coffin were fastened the marshal's baton and the decorations of the Duke de Montebello.